Okay, so thanks for joining today, both everyone here in person and online. Just for people who are here in person today, a little bit of housekeeping is that there is no fire alarm due to go off. So if you do hear a fire alarm, then we need to get out of the building and we'll go and be in the car park. And also we will have a comfort break halfway through the workshop, and the toilets are just at the bottom of the stairs. So the agenda for today, I'm going to give a brief introduction to BioVale. My colleague Gail will give a brief introduction to BDC, and then we'll pass over to Claire and Hannah from C2 Compliance. For those again who are in person, we've then got a networking lunch, and some people have booked some one-to-one appointments. For people online who would like a one-to-one appointment, we'll be sending an email out after the event, and you can sign up for a one-to-one then. So BioVale, for people who don't know, BioVale is an innovation cluster. We've been going for about 10 years, and our main drive is to support and promote businesses in the bioeconomy. We've now got about 800 members, and if you're not already a member, it is free to join, and you can find the details on our website. We do a range of things. We attend expos and showcase businesses. We deliver training to do with entrepreneurship, and through our business assist program we can help with all sorts of communications, website building, content, and we can also help you put on events. We do a range of introductions as well, so if you are interested after this event in meeting anyone else who you've heard from, let us know and we can put you in touch. I also coordinate a hemp special interest group, which was newly started up this year, looking at developing the supply chain, first of all in our region, but then looking more broadly across the UK. And our anaerobic digestion special interest group has been running now for about 6 years, and we have over 500 members. So again, you can join that through our portal on our website for membership. Okay. So I will pass over to my colleague Gail, who will talk. Oh yeah, so just to let you know of some of our events that we've got coming up. The hemp event, our next one is in April, and we've just got a bit of an opportunity at the moment if you'd like to join us at either Chem UK or the World Biogas Expo in summer. If those appeal to you, then get in touch and I'll tell you a bit more about it.
Okay. So thank you, Caroline. I'm Gail Shotland. I think I know about half the people in the room, and apologies people online, because I'm one of the BDC's business development managers. I work very closely with Caroline and the BioVale team around some aspects to do with the Biorenewables Development Centre. So we're a research technology organisation. We were established out of 2 academic departments who realised that there was a need to engage more closely with industry, but also for industry to feed back their knowledge and expertise into the academic sector. And so we were set up as kind of one step out of the lab, and with that, like a bit like the Roman god for January, looking in both directions. And that's what I spend a lot of my time doing. So talking to industry, talking to academics, trying to put together big projects that can help address some challenges that we're facing both societally and economically. BDC has 3 key areas, which won't go into a huge amount because the text is on the slide, but we have 3 focuses: looking at getting extra value from bio-based feedstocks, so working on the principle that one person's waste, for want of a better word, and in the presence of regulators, I know that waste is a regulated term, but something that somebody doesn't want to use or hasn't valued properly or fully. So using the technology and the skills that we have within the BDC to realise extra value, which of course is important for business in the current environment and going into the future. So following through from that, looking at the development of high value products, so where things are low volume but high value, but also right the way through that kind of triangle of value. So we're not just exclusively looking for the tiny molecules that are going to earn somebody other than millions, but also looking from the point of view that sometimes people just want a lot of stuff making very quickly, which leads me on to the 3rd point, which is developing processes for natural materials. So making something from A to B very quickly, but also something so that it's reproducible at scale. And that's something that we have encouraged the academics that we work with quite closely to understand that, just because they make something in the lab and then leave it on the bench to evaporate overnight, that actually might have an implication for industry. So we work right across that nexus. We don't just have lots of very good scale up and pilot scale facilities. We have a whole raft of business support activities which might be of interest to some of you in the room. You already know about BioVale, but in the unit that I'm in, which is business development, in combination with our BioVale colleagues, we can offer all these kind of aspects. So looking at market scoping, regulatory insight, we are not regulators, so we're not legally qualified, but we can help point you in the right direction and give some introduction to some of the regulations that you might like to consider as part of your business journey. Traditional and novel funding sources, so that's things that are beyond the research councils, beyond Innovate UK, beyond what an academic might look at, and looking at things that are maybe a bit more relevant towards one step out of the lab or bigger. New connections, obviously with our colleagues in BioVale and the deep connections that they have across the sector, promoting trade and raising the region's profile, because we believe passionately that Yorkshire is the place to undertake bioeconomy innovation. So the final slide for me is just to mention our Business Assist programme, which Caroline just mentioned as well. This workshop is being funded by one of our Business Assists. If you haven't accessed our Business Assist programme yet, I strongly encourage you to make contact with Caroline or me as soon as possible, because they're running out fast. Very popular. Gives you about £2,000 worth of pre-funded advice, guidance, support or access to our equipment, which roughly equates to about 20 hours worth of work, and it has all these kind of opportunities involved in it as well. So that's me done. If you've got any questions about the BDC, BioVale, obviously Caroline and I work very closely together. We've been sort of pit stop between the two of us, but you probably really want to talk about regulatory compliance and the green code. So moving on to C2 compliance, and I'll just hand over to you.
Thanks, Gail. No worries. Morning, everybody, and thanks to Gail and Caroline for inviting us today. And thanks to everybody that's in the room and online for attending today. Just before I start, I just wanted to really give a bit of an introduction to what we do. My name is Claire Forbes, and I am the Director of C2 Compliance, and Hannah, my colleague, will be doing the majority of what you've come for today, so the green claims code stuff. But I just really wanted to start off by talking a little bit about what it is we do. A lot of the time when I'm introduced to people, or you meet new people and you say, what do you do? I'm a trading standards consultant, and you kind of get a bit of a glazed look, and people think, what does that mean? So has anybody, those of you that are in the room, has anybody ever had dealings with trading standards? Yes. Yeah. I know we've just been talking, haven't we? We used to work alongside them. So I'm just going to run through some of the things that we cover, because a lot of people have, obviously trading standards is a regulator. We're not regulators anymore. We work as consultants. I do quite a lot of training, but just to cover some of the areas. So trading standards covers 260 pieces of legislation-ish, depending on what the government decide to do next. Always changing, but really broad range of topic areas as well. So just to start off with that, these are the sort of 5 main areas of things that we particularly cover. Trading standards covers all sorts of other things as well. But the first one is fair trading and consumer rights. So, you might not have thought about that in your businesses, but we're all consumers. Do you think as consumers, you know what your consumer rights are? A little bit unsure, a little bit unsure. So fair trading, what we mean by that is that, businesses need to be honest and truthful, basically. And that'll lead on, a lot of the stuff that Hannah's going to talk about in terms of green claims or eco claims or any other claims that you make about a product or service is all covered by that term fair trading. And it's about being fair to consumers. But it's also not just about protecting consumers, it's about protecting you as a business. And it's about making sure that you're operating in a fair environment and that other businesses are being fair, and it's a level playing field. So it's about being that fair competition as well. So I do quite a lot of work in terms of fair trading. So if you think about, I'll cover some of the bits in a second. But things like just, you know, making those claims, putting pressure on consumers to buy things, saying things that are not true, saying or not saying something. It's now, we've got legislation now that actually makes it a criminal offence to not tell consumers something that's really important about products or services. And then there's a consumer rights element. So, you know, both from businesses' point of view in terms of informing consumers what their rights are. If you buy something online, you've got the right to cancel it. But also if you're getting consumer complaints, it's how to deal with those properly and in accordance with the law, basically. Product safety, another massive area. So anything you buy as a consumer has to be safe. So we've got general product safety legislation, which covers all products. And then for some types of products, we've got specific legislation. So cosmetics, for example, chemicals, electrical products, toys, all of those sorts of things have their own specific pieces of legislation that detail, you know, standards, labeling, you know, safety tests that need to be applied to those products, just to make sure we as consumers, again, are all safe. Very similar with food standards. So I know there's a few in the room that do food. That is all about the composition of food. So what can and can't be in a food product, but also the labelling that's given to consumers. And you've all have seen, you know, high profile things like, you know, a few years ago, the horse meat scandal, all of that kind of stuff was Trading Standards' responsibility to try and sort out. Allergens, so all of that Natasha's law that's come in after, you know, deaths in relation to allergens. There was actually somebody not too far from here, a curry house that was in North Yorkshire, and that guy actually went to jail for manslaughter, having allergens in his curries. Weights and measures. So we all buy stuff that's weighed or measured, and you'll put petrol in your car, or maybe some of you will have electric cars. So it's all of that kind of stuff. So anything that's sold by weight or by measurement, length, area, anything like that is Trading Standards' responsibility. And actually, that was the first sort of responsibility of Trading Standards. So it was all about, well, I'm actually Her Majesty's Inspector of Weights and Measures when I was working in the local authority. So that was the core function. And it came, you know, came from, you know, the Magna Carta, that we should have the same size of bread and ale. So when you go and get a beer, it should be a pint. When you go and fill your car up, you should be getting that amount of litres, but it covers all those sorts of things, and packaged goods as well. And then intellectual property. So everything that you do, all your ideas, your intellectual property, so things like copyright, designs, patents, trademarks, we deal with quite a lot. So I used to work quite significantly when I was in regulation doing counterfeited or anti-counterfeiting work. So at the moment, we advise people on how to register their trademarks and all that kind of stuff as well. So that's just this sort of broad brush, but in terms of how it applies to you or how it applies to different businesses, I've kind of put that into different slides so we can think about if we sell directly to consumers, what are those things that we need to think about? So some industries, and we see a lot of people saying, oh, I work in an unregulated industry. Nobody works in an unregulated industry. All industry is regulated, because if you sell to consumers, a lot of these laws just, you know, will apply to every business. So things like contractual information. What information do we give to consumers before we make a contract? Have you got the right information on your website and in your contract, your terms and conditions, materials? Do you know about the law in relation to cancellations and returns and refunds and what you should be doing? Things like descriptions and claims, like I mentioned earlier, in particular at the moment, and obviously we're here to talk about eco and green claims today, but that does cover any type of claims that are made about products or services. Things like pricing, promotions, different selling practices. So as I mentioned, putting pressure on consumers to buy things. Has anyone had people knocking on the doors trying to sell them stuff? So all of that is quite tightly regulated. We've got extra cancellation rights. So it's all really about that sort of, you know, fair trading environment. And then you've got all your product specific law. So depending on what industry you're in, whether it's food, cosmetics, toys, chemicals, you've got to think about, is it safe? How do we prove that it's safe? Is your labelling correct? Are we giving consumers the right warnings? And then from your point of view, have you got all of that technical information that you can back up those claims with. You know, there's certain, you know, particularly for product safety and for food, there's certain information requirements that businesses need to keep so that regulators can come in and inspect what you've got. And then just other responsibilities. So, you know, if you did get a problem from a consumer, what are the redress options, and how do you need to deal with that complaint? How do you deal if you've got with a safety issue if one arises? So if something happens with one of your products and you find an issue with it, then what do you have to do? You will have seen product recalls and withdrawals. So, you know, for something that is unsafe, what steps do you need to take as a business to try and put that right? And then it's about putting, you know, what systems have you got in place to deal with those things, complaint policies, training for staff. As I said, I do quite a lot of training. If you're selling goods indirectly to consumers, so as a business, you might not be selling directly to consumers, but if you're manufacturing any of those products that ultimately are going to end up with a consumer, the same sorts of things. So thinking about, is the product safe? You might be an importer. How do you make sure that the products that you're importing are safe? What questions do we need to ask the manufacturer? What testing should you have done here? All of that kind of things about importing products, the import procedure. I was just talking to earlier about, I did quite a lot of work at the ports at the beginning of COVID, because there was masses and masses of PPE. Everybody decided we can't do what we normally do, so let's import PPE, and the majority of that was non-compliant. There are specific PPE regs which dealt with labelling, but also the sort of safety of the products as well, and the efficiency or the efficacy of the product. So we've talked about unsafe product responses as well. So that would be the responsibility of the manufacturer, not just the retailer. It's everybody in that supply chain that has those responsibilities. And then what about product liability as well? So if somebody was injured because of an unsafe product, what are the responsibilities? Doesn't just cover goods, services as well, and digital content now as well. There's a lot of, you know, things that are sold that are just purely digital products that are covered by our legislation. So the same things really, all of that information and cancellation requirements still applies if you're just selling a service. So it's about, you know, knowing what the law is in relation to that, knowing how to deal with refunds and complaints. Again, descriptions and claims apply to services as well as to goods. And we deal quite a lot at the moment with, you know, there's lots of things that are online memberships, aren't there? And, you know, you're part of some, you're paying some sort of a subscription. And I'm actually quite keen on subscriptions. So I've got lots of things on subscription, and some of those are sort of those more environmentally friendly products that I get delivered every month, so I don't have to think about them when I'm shopping. So all of that kind of stuff is covered as well. There's some specific rules that are just going to be introduced in relation to subscriptions and membership type products. Services to business as well. So it doesn't just cover people or businesses that are dealing with consumers or making consumer products. You know, there are other associated businesses where, you know, consumer law and trading standards law can have an impact. So, you know, if you do marketing or advertising, the laws still apply to that. So, you know, we've been working with some web designers recently who, you know, want to make sure that websites generally are non-compliant. From my point of view, I would say about 90% of websites that I look at don't comply with consumer laws. So we've been working directly with some web designers who will then, just with that extra knowledge, or they will, you know, they'll pass people on to us to have a look at the website once they've developed it. Branding, labeling, packaging, all of those types of things. It's a good, you know, it's just good to have that basic general knowledge of what businesses need to do. People that do accounts, things like import duties, it's all kind of interrelated. So it's a big sort of jigsaw, and we just feel sort of part of that puzzle. One thing I haven't mentioned already is property. So properties are products. You know, houses and things are products. So it covers how estate agents work. It covers letting, tenants, fees, and all that kind of stuff is all trading standards legislation. So hopefully that's just given you a bit of an overview of the sort of wide range of things that we do. So what Hannah's going to talk about today is really a very small part of that sort of bigger picture in terms of trading standards. But it's not, knowledge is power really, and it's you know, if we get things right from the beginning, it's much cheaper to get things right from the beginning and much easier than it is to try and rectify them when things go wrong. And unfortunately, you know, a lot of businesses that come to us when something's gone wrong. And how do I fix this now? But it's much easier if we've got that right from the beginning and put those processes in place. Okay, so I'll hand over to Hannah.
Right, so I've got a lot of slides to get through. They will be circulated afterwards for people to reference because there are some links within the slides. So yes, as Claire said, I am Hannah Forbes. I worked with Claire as a regulator, trading standards for 12 years before becoming a consultant. So what is greenwashing? The good news is that sustainability is firmly on everyone's agenda. So consumers, investors are interested now in the future of our planet. And that means that there is a higher demand now. There's a higher demand for eco-friendly products and services, but there's also a risk. There's a risk for overstating when it comes to your green credentials to retain and attract those interested parties. So greenwashing, sometimes called the green sheen, as well, I've heard. But essentially it's giving that false impression about a company, its product, its service, its brand, which is more environmentally beneficial than it actually is. So, and it ranges from the exaggerated or the imprecise claims to those that are intentionally crafted to deceive. So there is a range when we talk about greenwashing. And the term now, it's sort of, it's extended, it's got a broader concept. So it's things like emphasizing certain aspects of your product and service to sort of smoke and mirrors around the overall environmental impact of what your business actually does. So again, greenwashing is claims that can suggest that a product or service has a positive impact on our environment or no impact at all. You know, that getting rid of or implying that you just don't have an impact at all when maybe you do have a negative one, that would fall within the greenwashing term. So it may state that it's less damaging to previous versions of the same product, that would fall into it, or that it's less damaging to the environment than competitors' goods and services. So you've got this comparison element as well that comes into greenwashing. So again, it's a very wide definition. So claims can be made by manufacturers, they can be made by wholesalers, they can be made by distributors and retailers. It can be about the goods and services themselves, it could be about a particular component part, or it might even be a process within the manufacturer or the brand and business as a whole as well, how that brand, the trademark, the vision, the look of the business gives that that sort of view. So it's all about evidence, and we'll get onto that as we go through. So we're going to talk about legal framework, and Claire's touched a little bit on what we're going to talk about. So the Consumer Protection from Unfair Trading Regulations 2008, I'll refer to them as the CPRs just so I don't have to repeat myself all the time. But the main sort of aim of those regulations is to protect consumers from unfair or misleading trading practices, misleading emissions and aggressive sales tactics. So a bit of what Claire was talking about. It applies to business to consumer contracts, this piece of legislation, and we'll get onto the business to business element as we go through. So it's enforced by trading standards. And the key principle is that consumers should be able to make informed choices about the products and services before they make that transactional decision to buy. Okay. Officers and police officers also have the option to look at fraud. You know, if they can prove that there's an intent to deceive, there's other pieces of legislation that they can look at as well. But there's criminal offences within this piece of legislation. Okay. So businesses, again, like what Claire said, should not make claims that omit or hide information or give the impression without saying anything that they are more environmentally friendly than they really are. So when we look at this piece of legislation, the potential offences in relation to misleading actions and omissions, the regulations themselves refer to the average consumer. Okay, so what do we think of when we think of the average consumer when it comes to eco claims? Okay, this is a very complex area. Okay, they're making choices that are often more expensive to go down a more sustainable and eco-friendly option when they're buying product. And they're making a lot of their decisions based on the claims and the view of these products and services. Okay, what an average consumer knows about a product and service or a process or the business itself, all that is key in the decisions that they are making. Okay, but because it's a complex area, more information is likely to be needed so that they can make that informed decision. Okay, so the legislation, when we talk about average consumer, when it comes to green claims, is a tricky one because consumers may suggest, oh, I know all about it, I want to save the planet, but actually they don't know to what extent, okay, that particular business has an influence on the planet. And that's why we need to make sure that they're getting enough information to be informed when they're making these choices, and the legislation states that. So as well as having general legislation like the Consumer Protection from Unfair Trading Regulations, or CPRs, there's also sector-specific requirements, okay? So your business may be subject to legal requirements from many different sources. So with sector and product-specific requirements, it might be an area of your economic activity that falls within that bracket, or particular points in relation to the product or service itself. So an example of that would be energy labels that needs to now go on appliances and light bulbs. So that's a specific requirement that is an eco requirement. And those sort of pieces of legislation will usually define who in the supply chain takes that responsibility, who is having to make that assessment and apply that certain part of the specific legislation. But then you've got the requirements for general laws, okay? And that's applying to all of the businesses essentially within that supply chain. So that's when we talk about the Consumer Protection from Unfair Trading Regulations and the BPRs, which I'll come on to in a minute. So in relation to those claims that are being made through the supply chain, it's whoever the business is in relation to that commercial practice down that chain who's making that claim, okay, and the reliance further on down the chain. So essentially, businesses must comply with their legal obligations from both of these sources. So, Scott touched on it already, but everyone in the supply chain has a responsibility when you're going to make a claim and going to be able to evidence that claim. Close relationships is key when you're talking about eco claims. Understanding your supply chain, how they work and how they've applied that claim is key for you then further down the line to be able to apply the claim again, depending on what you've done to that product and how your business fits that product. So an example of this would be a packaging manufacturer who is then doing a retail product, maybe an own brand in a supermarket. Consumers, it's got sort of claims about recyclability. Consumers will make decisions based on those claims. If that claim is incorrect, both those parties in the supply chain may be liable for that claim. Okay. So it's very important that there's this trust and evidence that goes down the supply chain. So we talked about business to consumer. This piece of legislation, the Business Protection from Misleading Marketing Regulations, or the BPRs, is business to business. Okay, so it prohibits advertising which is misleading to other businesses, other traders. The term advertising within this piece of legislation is very wide. Okay, so it's any form of representation which is made in connection with a trade, business, craft, or profession in order to promote the supply or transfer of that product. So it's everything. It's not your usual sort of advertising that we would all know. And when it comes to being misleading, it's in any way, including its presentation, deceives or is likely to deceive the traders to whom it is addressed and to whom it reaches. So not even, it's indirect, okay? It's who it reaches. And by reason of that, its deceptive nature is likely to change their or affect their economic behaviour, whether that's transactional or anything else. And for those reasons, the second part, for those reasons, injures or is likely to injure a competitor. And it's all about that level playing field. It's all about making sure that other people in the supply chain, that there's level playing field throughout. Okay. So to prevent this sort of thing happening, you may have it. Additional environmental clauses now are coming in to contracts down the supply chain. Okay, so providing additional evidence to support the claims that they're making when you're a component part of an end product, all that sort of thing, having those in your contract in writing is part of preventing this sort of offence. It might be that you have to actually evidence the production process and make sure your clients or customers understand what it is about your business that you are making this claim, because they will take that information and they will rework it. And when that rework happens, that's when mistakes are made. But the liability needs to be covered. Okay, these are criminal offences again. So I think the biggest things are fines and a 2-year imprisonment. So there are big criminal offences, but also you've got sort of the financial aspect and the reputational aspect on your business. Very, very quickly, just in case anyone's affected by Northern Ireland, luckily, at the moment, in relation to these general pieces of legislation, there is no diversions, okay? So at the moment, everything stays the same, and that's nice to hear, because I'm sure some of you are dealing with some of the implications with Brexit and EU exit. So we're going to cover this in a bit more detail when we look at the code itself, but how do we standardise the science of sustainability? It's very complex. Is the first thing we'll say. It's very industry specific in some cases, and some of the methodologies don't cover the whole life cycle. Okay, the good news is that there are more and more work being done on this. There's more and more accreditation bodies being created. However, because of the complexity of everything, it's natural that we are seeing conflicting assessment methods being used, which again, from an industry point of view, is a nightmare. It's also a nightmare for regulators because it's always changing. And I think it has to at the minute, because I think, you know, we're starting from the first point. There will be developments, there will be more and more data that is collected and more ways of testing the evidence to substantiate all the claims that are being made. I have put some examples on there of certain certification bodies that are out there. So Food Foundation Earth certification is for the food and drink sector, and they are looking to launch a traffic light system that's hopefully going to help consumers understand. It takes away the element of words with claims. So from a business point of view, it might make it a bit easier. However, some would argue with food and drink, we've already got a traffic light system. So again, might be more confusing, but they're looking to do that, to develop that. There are independent assessment bodies such as Mondra who are on there, who can assess independently your business and then report and give an ethical score that they can then be used. What they will also do is they will identify the parts of your business that maybe aren't as sustainable as they could be, or the points that you should really make sure you are being clear that you're not at the same level on everything, because there's never any business who is going to have the same sustainability score throughout. Okay, there's going to be elements, whether it's transport, whether it's water use, whatever it is, where they're going to have quite a high level. But we're going to get better at this, okay? So once we start to see the benchmark standards coming in for different industry, that will make it a lot easier. And once we have that high quality data available, we'll be able to make these accurate measurements. But at the moment, there is still a lot of conflicting. Have you got a question, Gail?
Yeah, just whilst you're at that, so
Yeah.
talk about benchmark standards.
Yeah.
Are these EU or UK governments, or are they?
They're sort of industry specific. The problem that we've got is that there is legislation that is going to come in within Europe and other parts of the world that then we will have to wait and see whether we marry up or take a version of that into the UK. Now we're not part of Europe, we don't know what the government's going to do and where this sort of legislation is going to sit as a priority. But yes, I think we need the benchmark standards anyway, so that as UK regulators, we know what methodologies are being used and accepted. And also as industry, it becomes that level playing field.
I think hopefully most standards that are introduced are adopted as ISO international
Yes,
standards.
and
So
yeah,
hopefully, in terms of standardization, it will be.
and there are, and we'll talk about some standards that are already in place when it comes to sort of management systems and things like that, because there are some currently that some of you may be working to. So we're going to move on to the actual code now. So who are the CMA? So the CMA, their main objective is to make markets work well for consumers, businesses, and the broader economy. I've added a link there to the CMA guidance on environmental claims. It's very good. But essentially, the CMA have powers to tackle practices and market conditions that harm consumers or may hinder their decision making. It has powers to protect consumers from unfair business practices and unfair contract terms, of which it takes the lead role, but trading standards do a lot of that work too. They can go to court to enforce consumer protection law, and they also have the power to protect businesses from misleading marketing by other businesses. Okay. So the 6 principles of the Green Code, they're all common sense, okay? They're all common sense and they're all very wide. We're going to look at each one in more detail as we go through, and you will see that crossover with the wording of the legislation when we look at these different principles. So the first one then, claims must be truthful and accurate. There must be enough information so that consumers can make those informed decisions about what they're buying. They must not mislead, even if the claims themselves are correct, and we'll get into that as we go forward. So it's all about perception. So if you are using logos and artwork that's very green, trees, leaves, the overall impression of that product you may have an element of your business that you could make a claim on, but that overall impression through the way that it's presented could give that greater sort of impression that you are above and beyond, and then it wouldn't be truthful and accurate. Okay. You cannot overstate or exaggerate. Okay, and there's some cases at the end where we'll look at that. It applies to specific terms such as organic and broad terms such as just the word green. And we'll talk about the difference between specific and vague and how, and different elements of that. So just thinking about organic, for some sector specific, it's quite restricted with that term. So for food products, for instance, if you want to make a claim about a product being organic, 95% of the ingredients within that product must be organic, okay? And that's set down in specific legislation. Now, the CMA have been doing quite a lot of work and enforcement in relation to organic clothing. Okay, so in the world of clothing, there isn't that sector-specific legislation that sets out in relation to the term organic. But there has been cases where jeans have been found that have had this claim organic, but only had 35% or less organic material within them. And the views of the CMA are that if you're just using the term organic on its own without any other explanation, most consumers would expect everything but maybe the zips and buttons to be organic. So again, it's all about the specific term. So even that specific term organic in certain industries is not specific enough, okay? If there's restrictions and conditions or caveats on a claim, these must be communicated, okay? So compostable cup, if it just simply states that it is compostable, but it's not suitable for home compost, that again, yes, it might be correct, but it's not giving those consumers enough information. They're going to have to do something with that, okay? And they're making a transactional decision to buy this product because of that claim. The other point to make is that you can't use legal duty or standard features of a product that will confuse consumers into thinking it's actually more economically beneficial. So, for instance, in that, because, well, an example would be a cosmetic facial scrub that said, save our seas were microbead free, right? So microbeads were banned in products such as that. So it's legally, they can't be sold. To change that into an environmental claim that maybe an average consumer wouldn't know that microbeads have been banned in all those products, they're then creating an unlevel playing field within that market. Okay. If you go above and beyond your legal obligations though, then you are essentially able to make claims, okay? But just that standard sort of legal product, you wouldn't be able to. The other thing is some products are just naturally green, okay? So some products are naturally green, you can't big it up to the extent to make it more, again, creating that unlevel playing field, okay? So I sort of touched on this before, in the sense that you can have claims that are true, but still misleading, okay? So generally, the more specific a claim is, the less likely it is to mislead a consumer, okay? But if it is a case of smoke and mirrors, so if there is a significant negative impact on that product that comes from that environmental benefit, and the example I would give is you could have a garment, again going back to the jeans, you could have a garment that's described as organic, but a huge amount of water has been used in its production. Therefore, you would need to weigh up whether that percentage of organic material that's gone into there, actually, from an overview of how that has affected its environmental status as a whole, that needs to be thought about, okay? So just focusing on a tiny little bit for your business to try and big you up and make you more green than you actually are, it might be true. It might be true that you've done that, but it's the smoke and mirrors effect, okay? So when your core business is never going to be green, it's going to be hard to make any claims, essentially, okay? And an example I always think about, and it's not really in relation to this, but I was just so horrified, is the fact that Coca-Cola were the main sponsor of the COP, okay? So biggest plastic polluter in the world, main sponsor of the COP. And it's giving that perception, you know, to consumers and other people that might not know, that actually, oh, Coca-Cola are good now. Yes, they'll be getting better, but essentially the fact that they were allowed to be main sponsor doesn't really fit. Okay, so claims must be clear and unambiguous. The claim and the environmental impact need to match. So general and vague claims are more likely to be misleading. If you're making future goals, and this is what we want all businesses to be looking to be more sustainable. That's what everyone wants. But it's got to be communicated clearly. If you're not there yet and you're just thinking about it, or you've just put it into your mission statement, that's all very good, but it's got to be backed by strategy. It's got to be able to be measured by commitment. And I think a few companies have been caught out by this. Financial investment companies have been caught out by this. You've got to communicate that future goal. It's all right saying that you've got all these wild dreams, but there's got to be a plan behind it. The language needs to be understood by who you are targeting it to. So if you are targeting it at a consumer, we know that even if a consumer thinks they know about eco and sustainability, they probably don't. They need that extra information. If you are somewhere in the supply chain and you are talking about a certain process and you are giving figures or evidence, again, it needs to be easy for them to understand, okay? So it might be, there are examples where, you know, it's quite technical language that's used throughout the supply chain, but as long as everyone understands it, so that then it can be used further, correctly used further down the chain. In explanation, there's nothing wrong, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, about, you know, you can't get everything on a product, but you need to be able to somehow communicate that and for consumers to be able to substantiate and get that information. And we'll talk about how different companies are doing that. So the problem with generic claims, I think initially a lot of businesses thought, oh, well, we won't say anything too particular, we'll just make things green, or we'll just put a leaf on it, or we'll just use these sort of phrases that get bandied around. That's probably the worst thing to do. It's a lot harder to meet any sort of evidential backing from these sort of words. There's no legal definition for these words and phrases. They're things that have been created. So from a legal aspect, we haven't got that standardization of what these words mean. They mean different things for different people and in different industry. So it's all about making clear the relevant environmental impact and making sure that it's measurable, basically. Terms such as biodegradable and recyclable are also very problematic, okay, and people have been caught out by that, okay. So often it only applies to certain parts of the product, or you know, you have to take it to a different place. It can't just go in the green bin. So businesses have been caught out by these terms because there's not enough information and they can't substantiate that the whole product is recyclable, etc. So this again sort of ties back into the CPR. So claims must not omit or hide important information. So we know that what you don't say can also influence a consumer's decision. So again, it's pointing out a very minor part of the business or a very minor component within the business that gives that overall impression that this product is really green or really sustainable. Okay. When minimum information is given because of product size or anything else, there's other options to get that information to consumers. So it might be that you are really restricted. Hi. Really restricted with space. You know, marketing and the way your product looks is equally important. You don't want to cover it with lots and lots and lots of information. But it can be communicated through other means. So it can be communicated through website. QR codes are being used a lot now on product. But you must still consider the prominence in the way that you are giving that information. Don't omit or hide the things that are really important when you're making that claim. Okay. I'm only going to do a really quick bit when we talk about net zero and carbon neutral. So there's been quite a bit of research into this sort of term and what consumers think this means. And ultimately, consumers don't understand these terms. They don't know what they mean. And therefore, there is growing pressure on businesses to make sure that consumers know what this means and give them that extra information. Okay. In particular, when it comes to offsetting. Okay, so again, consumers don't really understand that term. Businesses should be providing information about the schemes that they're using in relation to offsetting. And it should be based on recognised standards, be measurable, and capable of that objective verification. And I've just put some other sort of things on there. So TAS 2060 is something that some businesses now are working to. I don't know if anyone's working to it here. But that is a specification that demonstrates a commitment to carbon neutrality. Thank you. So it basically creates a framework to help you measure and reduce and offset the impact on the climate. So any business can work to that standard. It shows that there's that commitment there. So when you are talking about how your business is changing, if you're working to a standard such as this, it's very easy then to evidence what you are doing and what your plans are going forward. In relation to ISO 14001, that's in relation to reducing waste and protecting the international and national environment. Okay, so it's essentially an environment management system standard, and it covers things like water use, energy use, pollution, and waste. So again, working to these standards shows that commitment as a business overall and can highlight the areas that you may want to try and change. Okay, so this is principle number 4. So comparisons. A lot of comparisons get made when it comes to green claims. Businesses do it with their own products, whether it's older versions and the new version. They do it with competitors' products, but comparisons must be fair and meaningful. Okay, so they must be based on clear, up-to-date, objective information, and you must be comparing like for like. I mean, it's very common sense, but sometimes, you know, it isn't like for like that they're comparing. Again, it can be against your own products or it can be against competitors' products. Again, when you're talking about competitors' products and you're talking about certain aspects, you're going to have to apply the same methodology to their product that you are to yours. And we know that there's differences within industry, different methodologies being used. If you're wanting to make a comparisons claim, you're going to have to do it with the same methodology. Otherwise, it's not fair. Equally, if you're looking at something that's a very wide term, you're essentially maybe not going to know the full ins and outs of your competitor's business. So the fact that you are claiming to be the greenest, I would struggle with the amount of evidence that you're going to need to be able to make a claim such as being the greenest of anything against competitors' products, because you're not going to have the insight and the data and the evidence within all your competitors' businesses. So the clear thing is the same methodology. So recyclable content, C2 emissions, all those things need to be based on the same methodology, and there are differences. And this also applies to business advertising too. So not just consumers. So this is an aspect where many businesses got caught out in relation to the CMA code. So if you're making a claim, you must consider, and that's a keyword, consider the life cycle of the product. So it doesn't mean that information about the full life cycle of a product or service must be included in every claim. It depends what claim you are making to whether this applies. However, consumers now think very widely about claims that are being made. So if you are claiming to be sustainable, one consumer may be thinking about, oh, well, you know, they source everything locally. They're using processes that don't use a lot of energy. The component parts must be good for the environment. You know, it's a lot of aspects that go into the full life cycle of a product. How the product's disposed of, that's the bit that sometimes gets mixed up. You know, we talk about how a product's produced and we talk about how it's transported, but we don't then talk about how it's disposed of and how long it stays on the planet and what effect that has on our planet, okay? And all these things are now being considered by consumers when they're making these decisions and looking at these claims. And that will change as well. That's the other thing. Consumer knowledge, behaviour, their focus will change depending on what's going on in the environment and the different terms that are being used. So claims must be substantiated. So there is an exemption when it comes to certain advertising push when it comes to this, but I'm sure the CMA would prefer me not to say that, and that it's just very clear cut. But essentially, this is what a regulator would request from you. They would want to see evidence. They'd want to see everything that you could show to evidence the claim that you are making. They could also gather their own evidence, and they do. They do an assessment. They don't always trust in the evidence that is provided, which is a good thing. That's what a regulator should do. And the key thing is that it's got to be correct and up to date. Okay, so claims can be on products for a long time, and they are basing it on data that becomes very old very quick. Okay, so it's all about how that evidence is maintained. They are likely to be objective or factual claims based on facts, and therefore I think even your wide claims, even claims such as cleanest, safest, the best in the industry, they're still based on measurable things. Yes, you would need a lot of evidence, but they still can be measured. So the regulator's always going to say, if you want to make a really wide claim, that's fine, but we are going to take every element of that, and we want to see evidence of every element of that. So it's a lot of work. So we looked at this previously when we looked at some of the accreditations and independent certifications that can be carried out. Being able to just demonstrate that your evidence is subjected to independent scrutiny is one of the things that they would expect, particularly if it is something that's quite complex or controversial. That again would help to show how robust it is in relation to the evidence that you're gathering. In-house evidence that has not been independently verified is never going to be great. That independent verification, or through a scheme that is industry-wide, helps the regulator to assess the evidence, basically. Again, if the information is publicly available, that helps, because consumers can then verify themselves. So it takes that independence away. So, you know, if it's supported by a study or a survey, that should be accessible to consumers. And that's something that you can put, if you've instructed your own survey, you know, that information can be somewhere else, but it needs to be communicated correctly to consumers or other businesses that may be interested. Again, proving broader claims, especially the more ambiguous ones, makes it more hard and difficult, and a lot more work needs to go into it. So environmentally friendly is the key one. We see it everywhere. It is very, very hard to prove an environmentally friendly claim, because you can ask numerous people what they think environmentally friendly means, and they will pick different aspects of that product, business, brand, process, where they are in the world, where the ingredients are coming from in the world. All those things will come into that term environmentally friendly, but you still see it banded around, and you think, actually, evidentially, that is a lot to prove to say that term. And again, we're talking about liability throughout the chain. So someone in a chain can make a claim that the end product then can't make, okay? And it needs to be key that that's communicated. They might be able to make a specific claim on a component part. It may back into the evidence that supports the claim that they are going to make on end product. But again, copy and pasting someone else's claim from further up the chain won't be able to be proved, okay? Should I stop for a break? Or this is just a very quick slide. So as well as the code, the CMA have done a checklist, which I've put a link on there. So basically, clear, accurate, up-to-date evidence, considers the whole product, service and business, backed by evidence, and that is key. Doesn't omit or hide information, and comparisons are fair, whether that's with your own product or competitor's product. And standard features of a product or legal requirements are not used to create an environmental claim. Next one. I think it's time for a break. Gone through that really fast.
You could reuse your course, and that would be great.
Probably break your yeah. That's a good point. We can start. Right. If you are all in companies, you can do us all that. Very, recycled bottles. Is it? Yeah, yeah, it's one of them. Yeah. The shop and box. Next to the British Farms. Yes, but I put them online. White, yellow. Yeah.
Well, they are currently, I don't know.
Do it, so actually do this. For all these things like zero.
That's why they.
Yeah, it's quite good. I think you get, tons of less in the whole, to put it up like that for you.
I just have a couple of,
Yeah. This is making the difference. Yeah, the same. Yeah, no, check them out. It's so like try it on if you like. Anyway, yeah, you might be here. Yeah, not. Lots of you have to. It's recycled. Yeah, so like
I'm very local actually. Okay, yes.
Regulators are scary. Yeah, well. That's all I need.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I'll get it back.
So, I remember this.
So manufacturers on 1 to 2, but apparently it's a 2-hour meeting, so if the one in PDU.
The other thing, I'm not sure where.
So the meeting I'm just having. Absolutely. Yeah. I've had to do down there. With me, yeah, that's why. But I like that actually. Yeah, grow up something. Yeah.
Not going there towards that point.
Not been any online, but there's been any.
Right, well, I hope everyone's had a nice little break there. Lots of discussions going on, which is great. So moving on then, we've talked about the CMA. We're now going to look at the Advertising Standards Agency, who are also doing work in this area. So firstly, who are the Advertising Standards Agency? They're an independent body that endorses and administers the code, ensuring that the self-regulatory system works in the public interest. And essentially their central principle is for all marketing communications should be legal, decent, honest and truthful. So again, working alongside some of the elements of the CMA code in relation to decent, Gail, just starting to say decent, but that's for things like things that would be considered sort of inappropriate for advertising, so some of the old school sexist adverts and things like that wouldn't be deemed decent anymore. So they have their code, so it administers the requirements of the advertising in the UK Code of Non-Broadcasting broadcasting advertising and the direct and promotional marketing and the UK Code of Broadcast Advertising, so the CAP code and the BCAP codes. The BCAP code sets out the rules that govern broadcast advertisements on television and radio, and they're licensed by Ofcom, so Ofcom get involved as well in relation to it. So in relation to examples then, and I think this is the best bit in relation to explaining some of the things that we've talked about today, I've picked 3. Oatly probably got a lot of press, and you might be aware of that one. But there are some really good examples of how they are assessing the evidence for some of the claims that are being made. Okay, so these companies thought they had the evidence. Okay, so these companies, when they made these claims, were quite confident that they had something to substantiate all the claims that they were making. Okay, so unlike some companies out there that don't hold any evidence for the claims or the perception they are giving, these companies all had something that they thought was going to be enough, basically. The other thing that I note about these companies is that essentially the morality behind the claims that they've made are good things. Okay, they are companies that are trying to do something that is beneficial, that is helping the environment, but they've still been caught out by the claims that they are making. Okay, so we look at Ryanair first. So they made 2 claims, low CO2 emissions. So in relation to that claim, when they made that claim, the ASA found would be likely to be not likely to be misleading. And the reason for that was they had reduced their carbon emission, and they presumed that most consumers, yes, they're an airline, would not take that in the absolute sense. Okay, so there is a pragmatic approach to what a consumer's perception is. So we're not insulting all consumers to think that they don't understand that there is emissions when it comes to airlines. The fact that Ryanair could show that they had low emissions, that was enough to be able to substantiate that low CO2 emissions claim. However, with the second claim, so this one, they claim to be the lowest emission airline. Okay, so when they were asked to provide evidence in relation to this claim, it was based on a study that was conducted nearly a decade earlier. Okay, so the world carries on, and they were relying on information from a decade earlier to make that claim. Obviously, the ASA made them remove that part of their advertising, so they couldn't substantiate that claim. So having up-to-date information is key, especially if you're making comparisons, because you don't know what the other competitor is doing. So it's a constant review process of the claims that you are making. Yeah.
So I was going to ask, how long does it generally take between someone making a claim and then them being called out on that claim and being told to remove it?
So it varies, and I was going to talk about sort of referrals to these sort of agencies, because obviously regulators will do some proactive work, but they rely heavily, and they have to show that there has been a detriment, that there are people being misled. So trading standards, the ASA, CMA rely heavily on complaints, on people making them aware that they have been misled by the claims that are being made, or that they have an inkling maybe that these claims can't be substantiated, and then they will look into it. And when you look at the figures, because they do on the ASA sort of reports, they will give numbers of how many people have reported an issue, and sometimes it's relatively low, but even that aspect that someone's been misled is enough for them to investigate it. But there are ways and means, and I think as a regulator in trading standards, we used to get a lot anonymous complaints that were from competitors. And I personally don't see anything wrong with that, because the purpose of the legislation is not only to protect consumers, but to create a level playing field. Without that, it doesn't work. Okay, so I think it's right that we get referrals from industry to point out.
I think sometimes it's only people in the same industry that
Yeah.
actually, they've got a far better understanding of
Yeah.
the claims that are being made and how can they possibly be making those claims because they understand the processes, whereas the average consumer that we talked about doesn't necessarily have that understanding.
Yeah. So it's a twofold with the regulator. It's not just always about consumers, it's about creating that level playing field and the potential of being misled. So in relation to Banbury then, so they created and were advertising a very innovative electric toothbrush. Okay, so they made claims such as 100% plant-based materials, hashtag no plastic was on all their social media, eco-friendly, which is probably the worst, and sustainably sourced. Now, as a comparison product, they may have been all right, because essentially what they had created was an electric toothbrush that did use a lot of plant-based materials, but the ASA took the view that they lacked a lot of evidence when it came to these claims. Okay, they didn't really have sort of in-house evidence about the 100% plant-based. They were relying a lot on what they thought they were getting from their suppliers. They 100% plant-based as well, even though it's an electric toothbrush, the ASA were of the opinion that the average consumer may apply that as an absolute term. So the fact that it is an electric toothbrush would mean that it won't be 100% plant-based, okay? Unless you can tell me otherwise. I think there's going to be elements of that product that aren't 100% plant-based, okay? And the ASA said, unlike with Ryanair and the low CO2 emissions, that consumers might think that that's an absolute term, okay? In relation to eco-friendly, we know that that's a really hard term to apply anyway, but they hadn't considered full life cycle at all when they looked into it. And they took the view that consumers would deem that an eco-friendly statement would mean that there'd be no detriment on the planet at all. Okay, so that eco-friendly, our business does not have any detrimental impact. That's the view that they take to make that claim, which Banbury could not substantiate. In relation to Oatly, so again, it was one of the first big examples that the ASA took, and I think from an industry point of view there was a bit of backlash because what Oatly were doing and their message essentially was a good one in saving the planet. They're very passionate about making comparisons in relation to the milk industry because they're an oat-based product, and they wanted to make these claims. They thought that they had enough evidence to support these claims, and they've put money into it. They've put quite a lot of money into making these claims. However, this is an example of being quite specific but not having enough to back it up. So you've got your generalized claims that are really hard to prove. They're being quite specific in what they're saying, but they don't have the specific evidence to back it up. They've only taken elements. So they overstated with some of their claims. So the claims in comparison to the dairy meat industries, they omitted a bit of transport out of when it came to the milk side of the industry when they were making that comparison, and they didn't take into full life cycle product again. So they only did it to a certain point, made the comparison, it looked great, but then didn't take into the full life cycle. Okay. They also, when they did the comparisons, and it was sort of a money and time thing. And the director and owner of Oatley said this in hindsight. They only did the comparison against one product line. So they're one product line against the milk industry. And again, it's not a like-for-like comparison. So they're using figures in relation to the whole milk industry and putting it down one product line. So when they handed over their evidence, again, it didn't reflect that comparison enough for the ASA to be happy with it. The climate experts' claim was based on one climate expert. So again, the fact that they used that and promoted it everywhere based on one person's opinion for a huge advertising campaign, again, was not substantiated in relation to it. What I think the point of it is people are trying, and that is always going to be a good thing when we want everyone to be more eco and sustainable, but it needs to be a level playing field. And it's not an easy world making green claims. It's really quite difficult because consumer perception is so wide. Do a little bit of a conclusion and then we'll have a little discussion. So again, what can happen when it goes wrong? So there's different agencies working in this field. So we've talked about the CMA, they are the lead. Trading standards, again, enforcing sort of your CPRs, your BPRs. You've then got the Advertising Standards Agency that are looking particularly just at advertising. You've also got people like the Financial Conduct Authority, who this is a priority to them now, okay? So they are spending a lot of time looking at sustainable investment products, okay? And they are, again, feeding in and taking action with financial institutions who are making these claims regarding sustainable investment products, okay? So they've got a strategy for positive change, and in their new business plan for 2022-23, it's a massive thing for the Financial Conduct Authority to look into because it's a growing area. Anything to do with sustainability is a growing area, and it's across the board in all industries. We know through lots of research, there was a 2021 study done by the International Consumer Protection Enforcement Network, which was jointly led by the CMA. And when they did that research into claims, they found a 40% of all green claims were likely to be misleading with the information that was provided on that product. Okay, so we know it's an issue. Regulators know it's an issue. What I think the CMA are doing are targeting the big players because they are trying to make an example that then hopefully will trickle down. And I think that's the right thing to do. I think it is the right thing to do. They are also focusing on certain industries, which I get because it is complex. I get because they're trying to find their feet as regulators in this as well. So there is a big push towards the clothing industry and fast fashion and other areas that they are particularly targeting. But I think it's the ultimate goal is that all the information gets disseminated and that people know where they stand with these sorts of things, and we see less and less of those general claims and more information provided to consumers. The other thing to note is, as well as things that can happen, so your website advert can be removed, obviously financial implications for that. ASA can take adjudications, you can get a formal warning, slap on the wrist, but it can lead to prosecution. There can be huge reputational damage. Oatley will stand by that, but they have then rebuilt themselves and sort of been a voice to that particular food industry that, you know, things need to change. And off the back of that, there's been more accreditation set up, more work into methodologies being used, etc., etc. So it's not all bad, but I think that reputational damage is huge, especially if you are claiming to be eco from grassroots, and action is taken against you. The other thing is that you might have to pay redress. You know, if consumers are harmed, they could, then it's a breach of their rights. They could look for redress as well. So there's all elements in relation to what could happen if it goes wrong. So claims need to be kept under review, and it's not just the claims that need to be kept under review. There's changes to legislation all the time. Okay, so in relation to sector specific legislation, there's changes all the time. Eco design regulations are coming in now. You know, there's things that are coming in from different angles that are going to affect the claims and what needs to be looked at as a business to make a claim. Tech as well, developments in processes, composition, use, how products are disposed of. All these things are going to be changing all the time, whether that's through legislation or whether that's through technology. So it all needs to be kept being assessed with what you are saying about your products and services. So we know that there's lots of developments in which are good in scientific and environmental evidence, and that consumers are educated on the understanding of what that actually means. That again is another huge aspect to all of this. Consumers don't really understand what claims are, what they mean, what net zero means, what carbon offsetting is, and all that feeds into how you review the claims that you are making. Consumer awareness is one thing, their behaviour is another thing. So we were talking in the break about, you know, there's a lot of surveys that are done about how consumers' moral compass sits. So you could interview consumers and say, do you buy sustainable products? What are the things you look for when you buy products? And a lot of them will say, I want it to be local, I want it to be sustainable, recyclable, all these things. But actually, with the cost of living crisis, everything else, and you look at consumer behaviour, sometimes what they say and what they do are completely different things. The fact that people will say, I recycle everything, I read every product, I take it apart, I recycle it properly, they may believe that they are, but a lot of the time they're not. So I think what consumers say and what they do are different things. And I think things like the cost of living crisis, when it comes to sustainability, is a huge thing, okay? Because people are having to make very tough decisions. And I've been to a few conferences recently where this has been discussed in every industry. You know, people cannot afford to do what they morally want to do, because a lot of these products are more expensive. And when it comes down to it, that's not going to be a decision that they might even have control over. So cost of living is a huge thing when it comes to this, but equally, the people that are making those decisions to pay that extra money in a cost of living crisis need to be confident that they are getting what they think they're getting and they can rely on those claims. Should we have a look at some products and then?
Yeah, we just had a thanks to the wonderful display that's in the room. I think everybody during the time we're having a break was looking at some of the products that we've got on display and looking at some of the claims that are made. So we've got these wonderful nappies. So nature boy and girl, so we've got that general kind of impression that it's natural, and then we've got, sorry, I've got my glasses on, contains natural and degradable materials, 70%. You know, there aren't any requirements for these type of products to actually have the ingredients on. If we're talking about something like a cosmetic, then we can check that, can't we? A consumer could look and say, well, what is the natural ingredients then? But we don't really know what those natural ingredients are. And, you know, are nappies, disposable nappies, are they eco-friendly, do we think? Probably not.
No.
So there's all sorts of things. I mean, Ecover is a really good example. You know, so you could speak to a consumer. So what do we do that's environmentally friendly? Well, I buy Ecover. Is that environmentally friendly? It looks green, doesn't it? So just, you know, the bottle itself looks green. But we've got hazard warnings on, which means it's got chemicals in which are dangerous. So, you know, if you take the product as a whole, then, and you know, it was taken over, was it? It's like Method as well. Method cleaning products were all taken over by, was it GlaxoSmithKline? I think taken over by.
Yeah, and Unilever, I think.
Who aren't an environmentally friendly business particularly. Vegetable based, I was quite interested in these. I've got a boxer, but I'm not sure these, I do buy biodegradable ones, but and we were talking about that biodegradable. How long does it take for things to biodegrade?
Yeah.
I bought some vegetable based compostable little tea lights. I've put them through my composter about 10 times now, I'm pretty sure, and they're still exactly as they were when I put them in. So I think I might be retired by the time they're composted, hopefully anyway. So we've got all sorts of things on here. Clean and responsible, safe for the environment, made from cornstarch, certified compostable, breaks down in 90 days.
We want to see some evidence of that, wouldn't we? That's what we want to see.
Yeah,
Most of it does, but not in a composter.
yeah.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yes, a lot of it just goes into general waste. It's generated anyway. So it's one of those products that you just kind of think, well.
And I'm not putting this in my compost.
No.
And I've used it.
No.
It's not the amount of poo my dog does anyway. It also, we've got recycled cardboard cores, and charitable product.
Yeah.
Again, that's not an environmental claim, but
It's still
how much do they give to charity?
Yeah.
Does anyone put clothes and things in those bags you get through your door?
Yeah.
About 5% of that goes
Yeah.
to charity.
very rich people that make a lot of money after the back of those charity bags.
We're talking about this. So this is a coffee cup. I think this is made. It's made from rice husks, isn't it? This one. Not plastic. Well, again, it's evident, isn't it, of what's gone in there. There's no requirement for that for the ingredients of that plastic to be on here. So we want to know what it is. If it's not plastic, is it 100% rice husk? And we've got silicone on here. This has got all sorts of claims on no plastic, biodegradable, tree free.
Would you expect that from a cup?
Made from
You was cardboard from, yeah.
yeah, it doesn't actually say what this. Yeah, it doesn't say what the cardboard's made from. I don't think, unless it's recycled. Yeah. It does actually say on this one. It says contents 400 ml rice husk cup. But it's 400 ml. Yeah, that it holds, isn't it? Silicon heat. Can't read, Hannah. And silicon heat sleeve and silicon
top.
lid.
Yeah.
So we've got not plastic again on there. So there's all, and we've got a big smiley wheelie bin on the back as well.
Because it's empty. The other thing to say is, you as businesses who are being sustainable from grassroots should have an advantage in this area. Okay. The problem is that you have got companies who sustainability is on everyone's radar. Everyone wants to be involved and feels like they need to, and they do. They need to have policy, they need to have process in place, they need to be moving towards whatever. You will have companies who have huge marketing budgets, but, and my example that I always give is a pharmaceutical company who has a consumer arm should struggle with this, because they are essentially never as a core business going to be green. Okay, they should acknowledge that, and they should not be able to infiltrate the market to the extent that it stops the growth of grassroots sustainable businesses. Okay, and I think that is what the regulators need to be focusing on to create the level playing field from and off, because there's other elements to business that we all know, like marketing budgets, and being those doors opening for them, that is easier for them, which it needs to be stopped. If their business is essentially never going to meet these claims, they shouldn't have a slice of that cake. Okay, but they're still trying, and you won't find any big business that isn't trying to make some of these claims or perceive themselves in a certain way.
And I think it comes down to that change in consumer behaviour, doesn't it? It's that consumers are looking now for those things. And now, in that, as Hannah mentioned, that cost of living crisis, how many businesses are making claims about that now? It'll reduce your energy. And there was something that was on TV last night that said it only, you know, one of those heated drying racks only uses 6p an hour. And actually, when they tested it, it was 10p. So all of those sorts of claims, and it depends what consumers are looking for, doesn't it?
Yeah, completely. And I think efficiency is a huge thing. And I think there's more, it's not just products that we talk about when we talk about these claims, it's services as well, whether that's investment products in financial banks, or whether it is actual services, you know, being sustainable, being green, being eco, and all this applies to them too. But I think, like Claire said, in the situation that we're in with the fuel crisis, the cost of living crisis, there are going to be opportunists, and there are going to be people really pushing and over exaggerating everything that they can.
Yeah, definitely. We've got all sorts of other products here. Maybe we can have a talk about some of those over lunch. But I just really wanted to finish off, and you can see our sort of logo is a radar, and that's kind of the model that we use when we're helping businesses. So we offer lots of different services. We've talked specifically about eco claims today, but I talked at the beginning about all those other areas of law that Trading Standards covers and that we cover as consultants. So initially, ideally, as we say, like we want to work with businesses right from the beginning, and to help, you know, make sure that you know, knowledge is power, like we said, and if you know what you need to do or know the laws that you need to comply with, you're one step ahead of a lot of businesses. So we would, you know, work with businesses right at the beginning to review what they're going to do, what their plans are, and then advise them on, you know, this is the things that you need to think about when you're developing those products, and that's the best time to start. Often businesses come to us and say, well, we've already got a product, can you review the labelling or the testing that we've had done? So we start off by doing that, really reviewing the business as a whole, the products, thinking about what legislation is going to apply and what that particular, and sometimes it depends on the size of the business as well, in terms of, you know, the level of testing and detail and evidence that you might need to collect. So we'll advise on legislation that affects the whole business, from all of those things that I talked about at the beginning. In terms of developing that's then looking at, we can help you develop the labels and the systems and the paperwork that you need to back up those claims. Develop your knowledge in terms of giving you some training, staff training, all of that kind of stuff. We do regular audits. So once we've got all of that set up, as Hannah said, it's a continual, it's always changing. So just because we've got something right at the beginning doesn't mean that that's been, you know, if it's a procedure that we've put in place, it doesn't mean that that's necessarily being followed. So it's auditing that at regular intervals and making sure that it's all still relevant. And then finally, which is where we often come in with a business, but we want to, if we've done all of this before, hopefully we don't ever get to that respond stage. So that is all about responding to consumer complaints, inquiries from regulators, changes in the legislation. And as we've mentioned, you know, with EU exit, all of the other things that are happening, there's lots of developments in terms of, you know, the legislation that applies at the moment. So, you know, we try and inform our businesses, things that are changing, this is coming down the tracks, and help to get prepared. If something's gone wrong, like somebody's got an unsafe product that's out into the market, what do we need to do to put that right? So, you know, we're working with a business at the moment that we've got, you know, potentially an unsafe product, and we're helping them to decide what actions they're going to take in terms of rectifying that problem. Are we going to pull it all back in, or is there something we can do to retrofit that product? Working with the authorities, and with our sort of inside knowledge of being regulators, Trading Standards is a very small world, believe it or not. So we know most people. And we get that, you know, I work a lot with the Chartered Trading Standards Institute. I work a lot with European organisations and the European Commission still, because even though we're out of Europe, they still rely on UK experts, because we're practiced in doing these type of things. So I've done loads of training across Europe. with officers. So, you know, we kind of bridge that gap between, and a lot of people don't want to go through a regulator. You know, if we said go to trading standards for some advice, and look like, oh my God. So, you know, we kind of bridge that gap. We can work with the regulators and just help you put those processes in so that if there is an issue, then you know what to do. Has anybody got any questions?
What about websites being compliant?
Yeah.
Or maybe think we should look at our own website. See, are there any-
You won't be selling, you're not selling anything to consumers, are you? So yeah, in terms of websites, it comes back to the legislation I talked about right at the beginning. It's about consumer contracts. It's about the information you give to consumers when you're selling things to them. So when you go on a website, do we know who that business is? You know the website address, but do you know? And that's a key thing that often a lot of small businesses will miss off. I work from home. I don't want to put my address on there. Well, that's a legal requirement. Things like refund and returns policies. So, you know, like I said, if you buy anything, pretty much there are some exemptions, but anything you buy online, you've got 14 days from when you get that product delivered to decide whether you want it or not. And you can cancel it if you don't want it. And that's because we haven't got the same ability. We buy something online to pick that product up and think, oh yeah, that's pretty sturdy. You know, we're going by the descriptions and the pictures, aren't we? So the descriptions and the pictures have got to be right for us to make that informed decision. But there's loads of people that have, you know, just haven't got some of the really key information on there. We've got the product and we've got the price and how to buy it. It's all of the other things that a consumer has the right and should know when you buy a product, because particularly with websites, you've got a website, I could take that down tomorrow. Then where are you left as a consumer if you've got a problem with that product? How do you contact them? So all those, you know, confirmation emails that you'll get when you'll be doing your Christmas shopping, if you're doing that online. I'm just teaching a group of students on Tuesday, and that's the assignment that I've given them to go away and do the Christmas shopping and check that all the websites they're buying from are compliant.
Sounds like nice anyway.
I know, well, it's better than I could have given them something worse, to be honest, but they'll be doing it anyway. So yeah.
I was going to ask, what happens if a manufacturer is misled by a supplier? Does the buck stop with the manufacturers making that claim to the consumer, or does it go how deep does the rabbit hole?
Well, when we're talking about criminal offences, so this is why, you know, in terms of claims, yes, the ASA and the CM, everybody would look at what evidence you've got. But in terms of actually committing that offence, all businesses have a defence. So where we're talking about what we call strict liability offences, so kind of absolute offences like speeding. If you're speeding, you're speeding. You can't, it doesn't matter if you saw the speed signs or you meant to do it or not. So you have a statutory defence, which is that you've taken all reasonable precautions and exercised all due diligence. So again, that does depend on the size of the business, and it would depend on, you know, not just taking your manufacturer's word for it. What have you done to verify that? So it's about having that kind of that checking process in place. It's a bit like when we talk about people buying things, you know, importing stuff from China. Oh, well, they sent me a test certificate. The Chinese are experts in counterfeiting. They can counterfeit an Apple iPhone that can quite easily send you a piece of paper with somebody's test house details on the top. So it's about doing those checks to make sure. So there are defences. It depends how much you've actually done in terms of verifying that information.
But the BPRs, if you're in the supply chain and you've got someone coming to you, component part or whatever, packaging supplier, and they are making claims to you as a business, then the BPRs is there to protect you, and there is a defence there within those two parties. It's who's sort of it's aimed at.
And it comes, you know, from a sort of a recourse point of view, if a manufacturer was misled, it comes down to that contract. You know, there's some sort of contract breach of contract, isn't there, between, because everything that we tell consumers about our business becomes a term of the contract, and if it's wrong, you know, there's a breach of that. And that's what we haven't mentioned actually, is that it's not just that action from regulators. A consumer could say, I've been misled, therefore I want a refund.
Yeah.
The Advertising Standards Authority was paid Brewdog. So I noticed they were in the press because they claimed that their beer was one of your 5 a day and it got banned, and they made a big publicity campaign around it, didn't they?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's a lot around turning negative publicity into positive publicity at the moment. And I think it's the new trend. I wouldn't recommend it because I think like there are other options that regulators can take that isn't just, you know, a bit of bad press. And I think the last thing you want to do is to cause more focus on yourself. But yeah, Brewdog are an example of a company that are doing that.
When it comes to, I guess, when it comes to products and claims made about constituent parts of products, so is packaging generally considered to be separate because there's a packaging has its own set of regulations?
Yeah, and there are, you know, we've got various rules in relation to packaging, and some of those were brought in a long time ago about, you know, making sure that packaging is reduced and
It's going to be used separately.
So as a whole, you know, you take you would take into account the whole product, wouldn't you? So it's going to depend on how specific the claims are. So if it says the cup's made from, where is it? Cup's made from rice husk. It's about, you know, a bit like Hannah said about, you know, making sure we've got all of the information. So not missing out that actually this box is made from cardboard.
I guess if the clear is the cup, then you're all right. But
Yeah.
just say this. Then you're holding it up.
Yeah, and I think it's that thing of, as you might, as a component part or a packaging manufacturer, be able to substantiate and make claims, you can pass, you'll use that information to sell to your clients. Your clients then potentially can't make those same claims, because whether that's going into their product, whether they're changing it, whether their perception as a business, if we're talking about quite a wide claim, you can make a wide claim as a component supplier potentially on the way that you operate, but that can't be passed down the chain. And just because you have that information to say that my supplier can do X, Y, and Z, they've got this accreditation, okay, you can't pass those things down the line. And that's, we've seen that as well, you know, that they've just stuck that on the box and it's actually not their accreditation, which is a banned practice under the CPRs as well. So again, it's having the evidence, but then changing it based on the situation of any product as well.
I was just looking at this one, it was quite interesting because we've got green toys and that's a registered trademark. It's a recycling truck made from recycled plastic, and it's also got somewhere, where do we find one that said circular economy on it?
Oh, it's made in the USA.
Made in the
So
USA,
how
yeah.
does that fit the environment?
Yeah.
And actually with trademarks, it's taken a while because obviously trademarks was around a lot before all of this sort of became an issue, but there has been that removal of rights around trademarks that are eco. The ones that are really, really specific about, you know, if I was eco trading and I had a trademark, those sort of things are being removed now. So because you can't, it's the overlap with the legislation, but there is this change happening.
So the trademark being rescinded there.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, so it's that overall impression, a bit, you know, a bit like this product, it's, you know, just having your logo green, things like that, just it's that sort of, even that kind of subliminal messaging that it's a green product.
They do that around sort of like nutraceuticals, medical products, so you can't use anything that might imply that it's a medical.
Yeah.
So you can't use like a health shield or so. So I guess they're coming
It's
into
the
line
same
with
thing,
existing.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the same thing, that there is this perception, whether it's colour, whether it's the use of a picture on the background showing like a planet, when really actually all you've done is show one tiny aspect of, you know, your whole brand or process or whatever it is. But yeah, there is this move, and quite a lot of products got highlighted when it came to like logos, brand names, product ranges, and they were informed, you know, you're going to have to change this. You know, you're going to have to change this. You can't be called eco soap because we know that you're owned by a pharmaceutical company. You know, that sort of thing. And there is this move, but it has to be gradual because at the end of the day, you can't just take things away. But there is this move for consumers and the level playing field.
And it comes right back to that principle that Hannah talked about, that average consumer. What if, and this is the question that you've got to ask in terms of any type of claim, what would an average consumer think? And what an average consumer knows now might be different about all of these claims that have been made. It, again, is something that's going to change as we become more knowledgeable and informed and educated about being more sustainable and being more environmentally friendly as consumers. So it's always going to be, it's going to be a gradual thing. And in the absence of those, kind of really specific standards where we can say, right, well, we've met this standard, so we can make that claim. The only things we've got to look at the moment are those decisions, the advice that's coming out of the CMA, those decisions by the Advertising Standards Authority. Should we get any court cases that actually people are prosecuted? I mean, at the moment, it tends to have been that more, advice from the CMA, ASA adjudications. I'm not aware of any court cases.
I don't think there's any. I think they're trying to make
in relation to
examples
green
through
claims.
this that are very detailed, especially the ASA examples. If you go on there, it will specify the parts of the code that they think they've breached and the reasons behind why they've allowed or disallowed certain parts of that advertising. So it is really good if you have a claim that you think you're going to make, just to check that there hasn't been something where someone's not made that claim for whatever reason. Any other questions?
It's really interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Good information. Illuminated as to what people can and cannot do. So thank you to everyone online as well. And if anyone online has any questions, if you want to email us with those questions, and we can pass them on to Claire and Hannah, and we'll be in touch should you wish to make a private consultation appointment with them.